Ever since EA first put on the UFC branded gloves and threw their proverbial hat into the equally proverbial ring, it felt like they were constantly playing catch up. When THQ folded, they had put out 3 great UFC titles, which not only sold really well, but are still talked about by MMA fans to this very day. To call UFC Undisputed 3 the WWF No Mercy of MMA games is not far-fetched at all. The game did offer a lot of high-quality content, lots of fun modes, loads of gameplay tweaks, and overall, it served as a massive swan song for THQ's run with the UFC license. Undisputed 3 sits in the same water as Budokai 3 or Ultimate Ninja Storm 2, in that you don't really have to be a big fan of the license to have a great time with it. It helps, but isn't really needed. That's a rare thing when it comes to licensed games, and a sign of just how good it was. But, alas, it couldn't last forever. While an Undisputed 4 was planned by THQ, when they went down, it sunk with them. When EA took over, we expected the world from them. I mean, not only were they a much larger company than THQ and thus could pump more money into a future UFC game, we were making the jump from PS3 and 360 to PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. When the first game came out, we were left a little disappointed. It gave the same feeling as taking a high-maintenance chick out for dinner hoping to get laid, but then ending the night by drunkenly texting your ex. Instead of getting something new and hot to play with, we were instead going right back to that same old crevice that we have explored 1,000 times before. We pined for something, anything that could match Undisputed 3, and what we got from EA UFC's 1 and 2 was definitely not that. But again, as stated before in my last UFC video, the number 3 is a big deal for games like this. It's when the developers use all the knowledge they've accumulated thus far from the past 2 titles and combine them into something new. To use MMA as an analogy, the first 2 rounds tend to involve a lot of feeling out. Trying to see what works and what doesn't, trying to find your angles, that perfect shot, and sometimes you can get a knockout within the first 2 rounds. But oftentimes it's not until the 3rd and final round that you get that much sought after hit. Which, you'll be amazed to hear that EA Sports UFC 3, thus called UFC 3 for simplicity and because it's shorter, is that hit. UFC 3 is easily, without a doubt, the best UFC game since Undisputed 3. I would even go so far as to say that it's the best MMA game not called Undisputed 3. In fact, if Undisputed 3 is the king of mixed martial arts video games, then EA UFC 3 is the Grand Vizier, plotting to overthrow the monarchy and bring it under a brand new, unprecedented reign of terror. A fun reign of terror, mind you, but a reign of terror all the same. Okay, let's start this up and... Where the fuck is that ringing coming from? If you thought UFC 2 had a lot of options, UFC 3 has even more. You've got your standard versus and event modes, always classics, I like seeing them here. Ultimate Team returns and it's the exact fucking same, it sucks the floppiest of donkey dicks. But there's a couple of big additions to the game mode lineup that really elevate UFC titles to new levels. First up is Submission Battle. The grappling and submission systems are identical to how they were in the last game, which is to say they are perfectly cromulent. In this mode, your goal is to submit and dominate your opponent. No striking allowed, just 2 dudes hugging and sweating and choking each other in the most heterosexual of ways. This mode's honestly a lot of fun and works well with the more limited controls of the EA games. I know I rag on the older games for having limited grappling controls, and I always go on about Undisputed 3, but a mode all about grappling wouldn't have really worked in the Undisputed games due to how contextual a lot of it was. My complaints come more from the position of a jaded mixed martial arts fan and not so much the casual player. I personally would have loved all of the intricacies of BJJ and wrestling to be in the game, but know that those are two very mentally demanding sports, and properly adapting them to a single analog stick would be difficult, if not completely impossible. Undisputed 3 had you playing a sort of thumb twister at times, just to incorporate those positions, so I do understand why EA stayed away from them. Missing positions aside, this mode is actually really fun, and it's a great way to get used to how the grappling functions. But what if you hate grappling, like the sheer thought of two people embracing in an attempt to dominate the other and make them submit makes you see red? You'll be happy to know that UFC 3 has 2 whole-ass modes devoted entirely to striking. And one of them's called Stand and Bang, that's just the best fucking name ever, okay? Like, whoever came up with that name, you're not getting paid enough. That should be your job. Just the guy that names things Stand and Bang. That's how I prefer to do it. But yes, 2 whole modes dedicated entirely to striking, which feels redundantly redundant. EA really felt good about the striking mechanics this time, and for fucking good reason. In the first game, punches had all the power of a Nerf gun, and in 2 they were better, but still not quite what Undisputed had. But now, ooh boy, these mechanics be good. Damn good. Gone is the directional inputs of the past 2 games, and you now have freedom to throw any strike while moving in any direction. I'll get to what's wrong with that in a little bit, but for now, we'll focus on why this system is fucking fun. It gives you a ton of freedom when it comes to playing the main roster. Previously, it was difficult to play as guys like Chuck Liddell in a believable way. Remember, this is a video game, a sports video game in particular. We are supposed to be role-playing, so when you are playing as, say, Chuck Liddell, for example, you are role-playing as Chuck Liddell. You want to be fighting like Chuck Liddell. Chuck likes to back up and swing, and previously backing up and punching resulted in an uppercut. Now you can freely hook and jab while retreating to your heart's content. This, coupled with the fact that swaying is now done by using the right analog stick on its own, makes the striking feel more free and responsive, and you can more easily get those good angles, those sways, those ducks. Everything about this striking system feels really good. And yeah, let's talk about the head movement just a little bit more. I usually complain that head movement in MMA games feels unreliable. In the 2 Undisputed games, you had pretty strict timing to avoid punches. It worked, but more often than not, you'd sway, completely get missed by the punch, and somehow still get put to sleep. But here, swaying is not just reliable, it's fucking good. Ducking under a kick and countering with a wild overhand that, by all circumstances, should have fucking missed by a mile for the knockout is absolutely the most satisfying thing ever. It sounds like a small thing, but when you have fighters like Anderson Silva, whose whole game plan is to just use Ultra Instinct and then counter, it allows for a greater feeling of immersion. Less like you are controlling the fighter, and more like you are the fighter. You can really tell that the developers wanted to make something that emulated the hot-blooded feeling of MMA while still making a fun, satisfying game. And that's really all it does, is emulate the feel of MMA. But I don't necessarily feel that EA Sports UFC does a great job at replicating the sport itself all too well. So I tend to wait before I go into the negatives of a game when I'm reviewing it, but this game actually does have a fair bit wrong with it. Nothing super game-breaking, mind you, and it's all definitely bordering on nitpicks rather than actual hardcore criticism. But I mean, I'm a guy on the internet, that's what I do, I nitpick. While it is nice to throw any strike you want at any possible moment, there are times when it doesn't really make sense. For example, you can throw a hook, an uppercut, or a jab regardless of if you're moving forward or backwards. But this also applies to kicks, which is part of the problem. See, when throwing a knee in real life, it needs to have that driving power. That driving of the hips is what makes knees so devastating in real fights. But That's exactly it. This game is just that. A game. It's not meant to accurately represent real life one-to-one. You're always going to have some sort of arcadey shit to remind you that the focus this time around was to just be a good enough of a simulation while still being a good game, not really sacrificing one for the other. And yeah, that works well. As a game, UFC 3 knocks it out of the fucking park. Hell, I am one of the people that thinks this game is better than Undisputed 3. Okay, put down the pitchforks and torches for like, just 2 seconds. 2 seconds, that's all. That's all I ask. Then you can kill me. You're probably expecting me to say something along the lines of, Undisputed 3 is clunky and slow and has awkward animations, and yeah, all of those are true. All of them. It is clunky, it's slow, it's got awkward animations. It's just a fact at this point. But UFC 3 is only the better game. Undisputed 3 is still a far better simulation of mixed martial arts. Stepping away from the controls and mechanics for a little while, there's something that has irked me since UFC 1. And it's that EA feels like they are afraid to confuse non-MMA fans. See, when you're striking, you would think your goal is to just knock the other guy out. But what if your punch isn't as strong as theirs? Well, in real life, you'd do all sorts of things like rely on faster punch speed to just outbox them and win by points, worrying more about volume than power. Or you could use your superior wrestling skills to bring the fight to the ground and do some good old G&P to secure the dub. But the problem is that when you do get a TKO, your opponent always goes straight out. No covering up, nothing. The ref doesn't even try to stop you. In fact, during the fight, he's barely in the ring, probably just having a smoke break. Worse yet is that there's times when your opponent is clearly out, like clean fucking out, to lunch, and you can just go and drop bombs on his face like it was London in the 1940s, and the ref just sits there grooving on it. Undisputed 3 was more accurate by not having every finish be a complete knockout. If you rocked your opponent and sent them to the Shadow Realm, they made it clear that even though the other guy wasn't necessarily unconscious, he still lost. Things like the ref actually getting involved to stop you from Ivan Dragoing your opponent, as well as doctor stoppages, and your opponent just not being able to stand when the fight is called, help push Undisputed 3 into being a better simulation. But being a better simulation doesn't always equate to being a better game. Does Undisputed 3 better replicate MMA? Yes. And while it's fun, it does sacrifice some of that fun for the sake of realism. Now, in MMA, usually if a guy goes out, it can be unclear if they're actually unconscious. There have been times when a ref has called a fight too early or too late, and the other guy was either clearly fine or just out to fucking lunch. He is out. He is not awake. He is probably never going to be awake ever again, and I would say so long as he lives, but I think that ship has already sailed. The lights are off. I am just surgically removing every last memory from this man's head, and the ref is just doing jack and shit and jack. He left fucking town ages ago. The game also only has two sort of win conditions. You have knockouts, and you've got submissions. Now, you can get a decision victory, but reluctantly. The game really doesn't want to let you have those due to just how much more power the strikes have to them. The game is designed for almost every fight to end in a knockout, which 90% of the fights that I have in this game, that is exactly how they end, even if you don't play as a striker. And I get that. I prefer seeing a definitive victory via broken limbs or blunt force trauma myself, but this is going back to the whole immersion thing. I bet you forgot about that. See, just like how Anderson Silva's game plan was to listen to Piccolo, guys like GSP would tend to wait out the clock. GSP had the most time in the octagon of any UFC fighter back in 2009, a record that he actually still holds with a whopping 2 hours, 42 minutes, and 4 seconds of total fight time. He isn't knocking out Anderson Silva. The problem with decisions is that they aren't always unanimous, but here, they are. You cannot have a draw. The judges will always lean to one fighter. There's also some weird aversion to doctor stoppages. I used to get them all the time in Undisputed. Coincidentally, not when I was recording the reviews for those games, because the RNG gods just fucking hate me. And yeah, they happen, just not in any of the EA UFC titles. Making this even more bizarre is Joe Rogan and Bill Goldberg will mention things like cuts or bruises, as well as a never-seen on-screen fight doctor who they say might stop the fight but never actually does. And the fights in this game do get pretty brutal. If you can go a full 5-round fight, with the planets align, both fighters will look like a psychic girl at prom by the end of it. And again, that doctor never actually stops the fight, which means that either there's no doctor or the doctor that is at ringside is really bad at his job. But again, those are all just nitpicks. Small problems. And ultimately, they don't really hold the game back at all. What does hold the game back is the fighter customization. Unfortunately, the nature of modern video games means that inevitably, you are going to have to step into the dreaded world of the internet. Are you tired of beating up the same artificial intelligence day in and day out? Well then, little Timmy, why don't you test your skills against a live human opponent? Well, golly gee, disembodied voice. I'm a sad, lonely youngin' with no friends who talks about video games on the internet. Where will I find someone to spar with? The internet. Hot dog, I've never heard of this internet place. Yes, the internet. What was once used strictly for sending messages between governments and the sale of marijuana to college students has now become commonplace in the homes of every good red-blooded American.
Get over it! Nobody likes your skin color!
No longer do you have to think your offensive thoughts, but now you can freely speak them aloud for millions to see how big of a piece of shit you are. Why not hop onto your favorite mixed martial arts television video game and see what sort of atrocities you can create? Fight tall black guys with maxed out stats and pink dreadlocks, or engage in fisticuffs with a man whose childhood dream was to be a Beyblade. You can create your own fighter and coat them in whatever nonsensical designs you wish. You can even give them max level moves and perks to make them the bane of every 10-year-old Jimmy or Susie that might have the audacity to try and enjoy the game with other people. That will show them. And if you're feeling especially bold, you can cover your virtual fighter with swastikas to make it so that you get banned so hard from the online that your future grandkids couldn't even play the game. Or why not make controversial historical figures backed by washed-up rappers in an attempt to show just how edgy and cool you are? Yes, all the cool kids' moms will be running for a clean change of bloomers because your sheer edginess just turns their loins into Niagara Falls. Gosh, this internet sure sounds scary. Shut the fuck up, Jimmy, you're 30. The internet. It's where dreams go to die. I joke, but this game's customization is honestly both the worst and best thing about it. See, there's not really a limit on what you can do with your custom fighters, so you can just give them maximum stats. Every single fucking stat you have, you can just max it out. If you want them to have max level moves, there is nothing from stopping you making this bastard an absolute beast. You want him to be the best wrestler, striker, and submission artist in the history of history? You can do it. Go right the fuck ahead. But that kind of does lead to running into really broken fighters online. You will have guys that are 6'7", doing spinning roundhouse kicks or submitting the shit out of you. You can even take pictures of your face and plaster them on a fighter. And that's how you end up with horrors like this. It somehow looks exactly like me while looking absolutely nothing like me. And I feel personally attacked by looking at it. And online is filled with calves, almost to the point where half the roster goes unused. I say half, but honestly every weight class has that one fighter that everyone uses. I would say you could make a drinking game out of how many Conor McGregors you'll find online. but that would probably kill you. KO mode made the biggest improvement it could have possibly made. No, they didn't tweak the gameplay or introduce a minigame where between rounds Bruce Buffer twerks. They added motherfucking Snoop Dogg as a commentator. And this man is both amazing and terrible. Terrible in that he takes away from the realism, but amazing in that he is fucking hilarious.
Oh wow, 2-piece with biscuits. And then I'm gonna give you some fries and coleslaw and Coca-Cola and macaroni and cheese and napkins, everything. Give him some dessert too. Give him a chocolate covered strawberry shake and I would give him everything.
And yeah, that's it for those two modes. You probably thought I had a huge bit about how funny Snoop Dogg is in this game, and yeah, he is, but eventually you just want to move on from those modes and dig into something leaning more towards a simulation. Maybe, I don't know, do some role-playing. Career mode is, like in the last game, just a bunch of menus, but it's been improved in a lot of ways. So for this go-around, I asked my buddy Regan if I could use his likeness as an apology for literally all of this, and he gave me the green light. So this here, yeah, he's the future heavyweight UFC champ. Might not look like it, ladies, but this is what peak performance looks like. The way career works is you have so many weeks before fight day. Each week allows you 100 points of energy, which you'll be able to spend on training in the gym, learning new moves, or whoring yourself out like the corporate bitch that you are. Before each fight, you get to select a gym where each one specializes in a different fighting style and is populated by real-world UFC fighters who will teach you how to be the best. Each gym has different training drills that all do things to raise your fighter's stats. Things like shadowboxing, doing BJJ drills, or the most beneficial drill, touching butts in the park. But be careful not to touch too much butt, because you have a fitness level, which greatly impacts your fighter later on. Overtrain and your fighter's stamina recovery will be in the toilet, but sometimes you'll find you don't have enough time to get your fitness to where it needs to be, which is where sparring comes in. Sparring allows you to increase your fitness but fast, although it does do nothing for your stats. It also gives you hints and tips on your opponent. And learn, obviously, allows you to improve your moves as well as learn perks. Oh boy. Perks. I actually have not talked about perks in the last two UFC games, despite the fact that they were kind of a big part of them. And that's because I was saving that little conversation for this video. Perks add a little extra depth to the game. It gives your fighter additional skills like an increased chance of leg kicks causing health events, or affecting your opponent's stamina recovery when you stuff a takedown. But they also do kind of break the game at higher levels, especially Zero In, which increases your accuracy a fair bit. For example, if you're making a wrestler, you have perks that do things like slow down your opponent's stamina regeneration on the ground or boost grounded strikes. But if you want some absolutely BM shit, make a Muay Thai fighter, max out their leg kicks, and slap on a perk that increases the chance of crippling. While your opponent is limping, their head is fair game, so why not use heavy hands to boost the strength of your hooks to lay the absolute fuck smack on them. Adding to this is that your goal in career mode is now different. See, title belts are temporary. They're fleeting. They only last as long as you have them, and once you lose them, you're no longer the big king of shit mountain. But this time around, your aim is to not just be the champion, but the greatest of all time. The GOAT. And I hate that term. It's so stupid. Yes, the GOAT. Which is a term I think is incredibly stupid. But it does serve to raise the stakes a hell of a lot more. You now have records to strive for, and getting performance awards is actually satisfying. Previous games just had them as sort of a thing, like, hey, you knocked this guy out and it looked kinda cool. Here you go, here's some extra cash. Kind of like in Smash Brothers, when you get all those bonuses that don't really do much besides affect your score. This time around, winning a Fight of the Night award can put you on the fast track to pugilistic success. I really like this idea as it gives you something beyond just fighting for the belt. Oftentimes in past games, I'd get the belt defended a few times and just call it a run. Yeah, you're the champ, but so fucking what? With the GOAT system in place, you now have a reason to keep playing past a few title defenses, which brings me to my next point of praise. Another thing career mode does that I can't remember any other MMA game I've reviewed doing is the whole thing with rivalries. Well, it's not as in-depth as I would have liked. Rivalries add a lot to the career mode. After 4 or 5 fights, you'll have to fight
your rival! Your destiny will be determined here!
And a lot of times it's just a slightly harder than normal fight, but oftentimes they can be the highlights of your career run. Your first one is the guy you fight in the WFA championships, who I feel should have been used a lot more. Maybe do like a whole Gary Oak thing to cap off the run. Oh, he was the champ the whole time! I do like that in between fights, you do get to read other people's tweets, like Regan's mom sending him wholesome shit like this is the sort of shit I live for. You also engage in light trash talk with your opponents, which will affect your popularity. Going back to rivalries for a second, I do really like how you can't train at the same gym as them, as it makes it so you have to find some other place to train in order to work on how to beat them. This makes it feel all the more satisfying when you do beat them, and then eventually train under them. Essentially making this into some sort of shonen anime about befriending your enemies to find true strength. So you've heard about me gush about how good this career mode is, and for good reason. It's a fucking fantastic mode. It's fun, it's engaging, it's challenging most of the time. So you might be thinking I have had no problems with it, and I have absolutely zero criticisms about it. You would be wrong. Well, I do have some gripes. Try to act surprised, please. My first issue is with how the energy works. Yes, it is meant to be limiting, but oftentimes I would lack on my training because I had to do shit to promote my fight. And granted, I don't mind having to promote the event, but many times I'd be just shy of reaching my fitness goal, only to realize I was short on cash and needed to do some stupid photo shoot to make sure that my lights stayed on. I also take issue with how you learn moves. It's through, I guess, mini-games, but they're actually fun. No, it's not the act of learning moves that bothers me, it's that certain moves are locked to certain gyms. Say, you're making a heavy-handed power puncher. Just straight up boxing. All you're gonna do is take those hands and shove them in faces. You would think that you would learn things like haymakers from the boxing gym, right? I mean, it just makes sense. You want fish, you go to the fish store, right? But no, instead, that's locked behind one of the gyms that specialize in wrestling. This is done for 2 reasons. One being that this is mixed martial arts. Yes, leg kicks and shit are tools used by a lot of wrestlers to shoot in, but it just irks my OCD-riddled brain. Like, just organize this shit, come on! Another problem, or rather odd omission, is just how little interaction you have outside of fights. I know I said that this is a really good mode for role-playing, and I stand by that, but it could be improved in a lot of ways. Going back to Undisputed 2010, we had post-fight interviews with Joe Rogan. Bring that shit back. They show these great cutscenes of our fighter at things like weigh-ins and press conferences, and how cool would it be if we could partake in them, maybe have dialogue trees, or pull a Conor McGregor and just go off the fucking deep end. I feel like if they had a mechanic where your answers during press conferences could do things like affect your popularity or how marketable you are, which would not only boost how much money you can make from the fights, but give you higher profile opponents, as well as sponsorship deals. I know sponsorships aren't really as much of a thing these days, but having things like supplement deals to boost your income, or maybe you make a racist joke at the expense of Luke Rockhold and have to have your PR team do damage control. I honestly have a bunch of ideas for what I'd like to see in a future UFC games career mode, and maybe I'll do a video on that at some point. But for now, I guess we'll move on. My last major issue is just how repetitive the game tends to get after your title fight. Like past games, you will run into the same 5 or 6 dudes ad nauseum. You'll slam hands with Mark Hunt a couple times, probably winning by full frontal lobotomy each and every time. The weird thing is, it doesn't have to be like that. See, at the early point of your career, the game fills the roster out with calves. Just do that. But honestly, again, those are minor complaints that don't really add up to a whole lot. In fact, they just kind of make me appreciate the game a little bit more. I don't know what it is. It's when you see like something that's perfectly done, like a piece of art from an AI. You can tell that there was no human instinct involved in the design of that. But you look at a painting done by, I don't know, an actual human, and you start to see imperfections, and those imperfections, those flaws, those blemishes, they make you appreciate human ingenuity just a little bit more. And those good things extend to the roster, which I believe has about 234 fighters. The DLC this time was sparse, with Mike Tyson, Sakuraba, and unfortunately Boss Rutan being left in the second game, although Bruce Lee returns. Again. Instead of DLC, the developers just added fighters in through free updates, which I love. For example, Dan Severn and Chael Sonnen weren't in the initial game, but got added through additional updates. I do, however, feel they kind of went a little crazy on the guests this time around. Like, we think Mortal Kombat 11's bad. No. See, Joe Rogan's back to Throwdown, which is cool. But you can now play as UFC President Dana White, and get revenge on everyone that no longer fights in the UFC. They also added in Andre Bishop and Isaac Frost from Fight Night Champion, and as someone who ranks FNC as one of the best games ever made, that does make me a little happy. The weirdest inclusion is that if you go through tournament mode, name your event Bruce Buffer, you can unlock him as a playable character. And honestly, he sucks, but he's fun. But, want to know what EA UFC 3 does add in? If your guess was true open-weight fights, pat yourself on the ass. Yes, this means you can have that legendary battle between Dan Severn and Demetrius Johnson that we so rightfully deserve. The only issue with this is that when having two fighters in vastly different weight classes grapple, the smaller guy just grows like he's fucking Apache Chief, so that the game doesn't have an aneurysm trying to figure out how a guy that's 130 is grappling a dude that's pre-fight weight is 100 pounds heavier. And that's a small thing, definitely a lot closer to a nitpick than actual criticism. And yeah, that's it for EA Sports UFC 3. And I know, I talked about everything. I exhausted all the things that I have to talk about this game. I didn't leave anything out. No, not one detail. I talked about every mode. I talked about the roster. We talked about career mode. We did all that. I did like that funny little thing with the 1950s PSA style thing about the internet. Oh, it's scary. I didn't forget anything. I don't want to play Ultimate Team, okay? The reason why I don't care to talk about Ultimate Team is simply because it is not fun. This is the only mode with microtransactions, which you can completely bypass and just play the game. But still, it's designed with them in mind. My issue with Ultimate Team is that it relies so heavily on loot boxes, and no game has ever been improved by surprise mechanics. See, it's not fun to have to spend money, real or otherwise, on something in hopes that you get something good. And a lot of the time, you'll be spending currency on packs to get that one move to add to your fighter's toolset, only to constantly get shit you already have. And while it's cool to see things like what if Dana White was an absolute monster in the ring, or what if Conor McGregor could actually fight, that's kind of what we already have career mode for. There's also an online component to this, but honestly, they could have just added online gyms to the career mode, because Undisputed 3 had that. Ultimate Team feels like it exists solely to shove microtransactions in a game that they don't really have a place in, which is effectively every game ever made. And while I'm glad EA Vancouver showed some degree of restraint, the fact that they're here at all doesn't exactly bode well for the series going forward. Now that's it. That's all I have to say. That's all that there is to talk about EA Sports UFC 3. It is the much needed successor to Undisputed 3 in a lot of ways. I mean, yeah, but also kind of no. It does its best not to copy too much from Undisputed 3, like no pride mode, no online camps, nothing of that sort. But instead, it seeks to be its own thing. Really, the only thing the two have in common is being damn good UFC games. UFC 3 seeks to break free of the shackles that have held the series down for so long and make its own mark on the franchise, which is why I am giving it 4 Anderson Silvas out of 5. And I use Anderson Silvas as a unit of measurement because I can fully understand someone saying that this is the best MMA game ever made. I don't 100% agree with that, but it's certainly up there. UFC 3 sets out to make the UFC games fun and enjoyable without sacrificing a whole lot in terms of technical depth or realism. And you know, it's always debated who's the greatest fighter of all time. Many say Anderson Silva, some say Khabib, some say Nate Diaz, I say GSP. But none of us are wrong. Just like if you prefer this game over Undisputed 3, I can kinda see why. UFC 3 is an absolute treat. From the greatly improved striking to the more enjoyable career mode, a plethora of other modes to satisfy your bloodlust, the massive roster, there is just so much to enjoy in the confines of this game. It feels like a combat sports sandbox. Think Minecraft with more arm bars. You can customize almost every facet of this game to your liking, and just firing the game up for a few quick matches after a long day of work feels so good. While the game has some issues, not a single one of them damages the game in any legitimate manner, except maybe Ultimate Team. But they do keep the game from being a perfect 5 out of 5. Really, the only legitimate thing that might harm the game is Ultimate Team, which I really can't see extending past this game. So with EA Sports UFC 3 freshly reviewed, I have high hopes about EA Sports UFC 4. I mean, what, you think EA is just gonna fuck it up after this?